Okay, let's move on and talk about the last sections in this chapter, the section on memory and the section on language. So let's start with memory first. Now, if we talk to 4-year-olds, they seem to be able to remember events from about 1.5 years earlier, so about the age of 2. Now, things that can affect what children remember are their interest level in what happened, the retrieval cues that they have. They find it easier to remember things that are fixed in time and logical in time for day-to-day activities, things like that. Now, we know that young children tend to form scripts for events and things that actually happen, particularly, on things that happen fairly routinely, like what they do every day, or even things like a birthday party. What do you do at a birthday party? Well, you eat cake, you have presents, you play games, those sorts of things. Scripts become more elaborate as they're told and start to resemble autobiographical memory or episodic memory, things about that happen in their life. And these memories are going to be more clear, more highly developed, the more children talk about them with their parents and others. And now, so parent and caregiver interest and questioning regarding what a preschooler remembers is going to facilitate a stronger memory of those ideas and those events. Now we know that preschoolers probably remember more than they often report, and that just by asking by verbal report what they remember, it probably underestimates what they actually do remember. Now, again, one memory strategy for helping them remember things is rehearsal. They're not really able to do this on their own. They don't automatically go to that, where you or I might rehearse something over and over and over, repeat something, use flashcards, whatever, practice at trying to remember something. Preschoolers don't have that mechanism usually in place until about 5, and so we need to help them with that. They need those outside cues. To be in order to do that. They need question about it. They need help with reviewing it. They also help sorting objects into different categories. Does help also seem to also help enhance their memory. And then eventually these memory strategies seem to rehearsal and categorizing and sorting things seems to be taken over automatically about the time of age 5. So when they're in this early in the stage, about 2 to 5, they need some extra help with memory. But about the time they're 5, they're able to sort of do these things on their own. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is language development. And this is an interesting labeled section, Why Daddy Goat Away. And we're going to talk about that more here in a minute. Now, language development is huge during this period of life. Preschoolers learn around an average of 9 words a day. That's a lot of words. That's huge vocabulary building. And there are some things that they do that help to facilitate that kind of quantity when it comes to vocabulary development. The first one is what's called fast mapping. So, like your book says, word learning doesn't occur gradually. But kids are going to, it's a quick process where kids are attaching new words to its appropriate concept. They seem to have certain biases or constraints that want them to attach certain words to certain ideas, and they do that very quickly. They also have what's called whole object assumption, and they assume that words refer to a whole rather than parts. So if you point at an animal and say doggy, they're going to assume that you mean the whole dog, regardless of what the dog is doing, regardless of what the dog looks like. You're not just pointing at the head or the tail. You're denoting that doggy is the whole dog. So they have that whole object assumption. They also have contrast assumption, meaning they assume that objects have only one label. So let's say we show 2 pictures to a little one. We show them a picture of a dog and a picture of a lemur. And you say, okay, one of these is a lemur, but you don't tell them which one. Well, if they already know what a dog is, they're going to know that that picture of a dog is a dog already. So they're going to assume that, well, since the dog already has the label of dog, that this thing they don't know already must be the lemur, because the dog already has a label. The thing they don't know needs a label. You've given them the label. They're going to attach that word lemur to the picture of the thing that they're unfamiliar with. So that contrast assumption, again, helps them build that vocabulary, along with the whole object assumption and fast mapping. Now, vocabulary is one thing. Learning words and learning things have labels is one thing, but putting together sentences, ideas, questions, that's grammar. And that really starts to begin to develop in the 3rd year of life. Now, one of the things that happens during the development of of grammar, is a concept called over-regularization. Now, we have grammatical rules in place, and they're used in English relatively often, but children apply those rules very rigidly, and sometimes the rules get bent, they don't apply, and kids still then want to apply those rigid rules. So if we talk about, let's say, the word go, I am going to the grocery store, all right? Well, many times if we want to talk about past tense, we would attach ed or d to a word, and that's going to represent the past tense. But go is different. Go, the past tense of go is not goed. The past tense of go is went. But until kids learn that, they're probably going to want to attach that D or that ED to goed and say, well, I'm going to the grocery store, I goed to the grocery store. That's over-regularization. We talk about in terms of words that are singular versus plural. If, the singular, we have doggy, which is singular, and then the plural of doggy is doggies. We add an S to it. But let's say we're talking about a mouse. Well, we have a mouse. Well, if we're talking about a bunch of them, we don't say mouses. We don't add an S to mouses. We say mice. So those rules of grammar that kids learn, sometimes we know words don't always follow the rules, but they tend to want to apply those rules very rigidly, which then results in over-regularization, but also reflects a correct knowledge of grammar. They get it. They understand how grammar works, even though, unfortunately, English doesn't work that way all the time. We also know that they kind of move from more concrete in the moment to the abstract when they're asking questions. So what, who, where questions, when they're 2, start first, right? Very logical, very tangible. Who's going? Where are they going? What is happening? Versus why is it happening? How? When? Those are much more abstract ideas, and those start to come along on let's say, I think about the age of 3 or 4. By 4, that we're much more in kind of able to ask questions that are more abstract and understand them. When we're young, when we're 2, we're much more in the moment, much more concrete, what, who, where. Lastly, when it comes to development of grammar, using the passive voice is something that doesn't come along until about the age 5 or 6. Passive voice is very hard for 2 and 3-year-olds to understand, and they hardly ever use the passive voice. So, for instance, we would say the dog ate food. But if we want to say that passively, we would say the food was eaten by the dog. Now, that's in the passive voice, not in the active voice. And that might be, if we say the food was eaten by the dog, that might be very difficult for the 2 or 3-year-old to understand. And they certainly wouldn't say it like that. So the passive voice isn't something that develops use and understanding until about 5 or 6. Okay, lastly, we want to talk about pragmatics and language and cognition. Pragmatics are the practical aspects of communication. That's how we use language in certain situations. So how we say things, the words we use, even the tone of voice we use tends to change depending on the person. and the situation. And so even when children are at play, if they are pretending to be teachers, doctors, those kinds of things, their language, how they express themselves may change, versus if they were just expressing themselves as themselves. So they know how to fit their language to the situation. Now, lastly is language and cognition. How does that happen? Which comes first? Kind of a chicken and an egg discussion. And the research is inconclusive. Now, Piaget would assert that cognition, cognitive development of those categories of things happens, and then we learn the words that label things, and then we put the words and the labels in the categories that are pre-structured. Other theorists claim that we learn language and words, and we create those cognitive classes in order to have a place to put them, so that the cognitive classes to understand things are created because of the words that we learn and the labels that we learn. Now, Vygotsky maintained that it's kind of a mishmash between the two. What he said, the way he kind of described this was twofold. What he would say is that in the early stages of language, the concepts often precede words, but later language influences thought. So Vygotsky believed that during the first year, the things we say and the things we think about are different. And it isn't until the second year when we start to understand that the words or that objects have labels, and then we want to learn the labels for things. We're very self-directed. We start asking questions, and that creates the thoughts. Not only do we put the labels on categories that we already have, but we create new categories for new words and labels that we are learning. Now, one of Vygotsky's concepts around this is what he called inner speech. When we're young, we have a lot of what's outer speech. We have a lot of vocalizing our thoughts, talking ourselves through things. You might see little ones kind of jabbering their way through playing or putting things away or whatever they're doing. They're kind of giving themselves some vocal direction, if you will. They're thinking out loud. But eventually, they start to internalize those thoughts and start to develop what he called inner speech. And what he thought was like your book says, the ultimate binding of language and thought. It originates in vocalizations that can regulate our behavior and become internalized. So we can think in words, and that then affects how we behave, and we don't have to say the words out loud. And according to Vygotsky, that's the ultimate coupling of language and development. All right, our cognitive development. Now, that is the end of chapter 7. Lots of information here, lots of interesting stuff. Be sure to check out the course resources with the videos and things I've provided for you to help illustrate some of these concepts a little bit better. And we will move on then to chapter 8.